Hello everyone, Atheatos here. And yeah, it's now my turn to have a look at these very popular 386 replacement chips, the 486 DLCs. These chips are the Cyrix offering on the 386 market. But yeah, in order to have a better understanding of what this chip actually is, we have to do a bit of historical talk. You see, Cyrix up to this point was only making some floating point units. And somewhere around there, around 92-93, they went into the CPU business, but they never really made the 386 core. Their first CPU was actually a 486, and what we have here is the same core cut down and put in a package to be compatible with 386 motherboards. So compared to a normal 386 CPU, this one has a few more optimizations and 486 instructions, and also comes with some integrated level 1 CAS. Now this one might not be compatible with all 386 motherboards, but yeah, clock to clock will be always faster than a real 386 CPU. Now of course Cyrix was a bit late on this market, as this was released around 1992, but still a very interesting and very popular chip these days. Now all these three look different, but internally are all the same. Yeah, Cyrix back then had the policy to cross-license its cores to other manufacturers, and in this case we have Texas Instruments, but later IBM also joined this game. Still, the original Cyrix one have this very nice gold logo, and yeah, these are always the best looking ones. In practice I didn't notice any performance difference. Now the 486 DLC is the most common one, and you can still easily find it, but it is not the only one of this series of CPUs. There is also the 486 SLC. This is nothing more than the SX version of the 486 DLC, so it has a bus interface of 16-bit. This one I have only seen in this SMT form factor. Now I have a few of these, however I don't have a 16-bit motherboard. So here I want to propose to you to have a look at this YouTube channel, the K2's Retro Workshop. This is a nice channel by a very skilled engineer, and I really enjoy his modding videos. So he has done a lot of this on the 486 SLC topic, and I really enjoyed of course the last one where he also overclocked to 50 MHz. I will put a link to this video in the description, and maybe use a little bit of the results as a comparison. Then we have the DRX series. These ones have also an internal clock multiplier by 2. That is one more 486 feature. Thus these chips could clock internally way higher, up to 50 or 66 MHz, while the bus was running at 25 or 33. Unfortunately this is an extremely rare chip, and yeah, I don't have it. To my understanding, you are not forced to use this 2x multiplier, and it is set by some register setting. If I ever manage to get one, it will be very interesting, as with something like that I will probably be able to push my motherboard to the max and see what is the maximum bus for real, but I don't see myself having one of these anytime soon. Again, K2's Retro Workshop has the CPU, and has done some interesting videos. Then you see we are not finished here. All these DLC, SLC, DRCX chips come with 1 kilobyte of level 1 CAS, but later also another variation was released with 8 kilobytes of level 1 CAS, and that is the 486 SXL and SXL2. Unfortunately, again, these are very rare chips, and yeah, I don't have any of these. What I have is these little two ones, and the marking on this looks exactly the same. However, these actually do not fit into a 386 motherboard. While the core is still the same, it's a 486 SXL. These are using a package with 168 pins. That is a 486 socket, while the normal 386 replacement CPUs have a 132 pin one. Now these two are very special and strange chips, and these are definitely a topic for another video. Now the 486 SXL2 was recently reviewed by CPU Galaxy. It is as usual a very interesting video, and I will link it also in the description. Of course, he also has a few pieces of the 486 DLC, and he has promised that he will check them in the future. I'm really waiting to see this comparison. Now again, this is a processor with an internal clock multiplier of 2, and I was very curious and asked him if this can operate with a 50 MHz bus and a clock multiplier of 1. He confirmed that this is possible, so I bet he has more plans for videos on the CPU, and thus it is very unlikely for me to find one. I'm really looking forward for any updates on this topic here. So yeah, back to our chips, and for sure I'm limited to the 486 DLC that only has 1 kilobyte of level 1 cache and also lacks the ability to multiply the clock internally. However, I think you know well enough how I do things in this channel. Yeah, I'm gonna overclock all this to the limit with my fully optimized modded M326 motherboard with this TVGA video card. And all the nice stuff as 256 kilobytes of level 2 cache, custom memories, full control over the clock generator and the VDD of the CPU. But before we go into the benchmark and overclocking results, another important topic here is regarding the compatibility of these CPUs. You see, in practice, depending your motherboard, you might have to tweak some registers. And then again, depending on your motherboard, you might never manage to get your level 1 cache to work completely perfectly. So either way, your motherboard will come with a default configuration that is set by the BIOS. And then using a DOS tool, if needed, you can modify the values of these registers. Here is a very nice thread from Vogons that basically has a collection of tools for setting these registers for all kinds of CPUs. Yeah, here in the end there is a download link for everything. Also, of course, a very nice discussion on this topic. So here for the Cyrix we want from this folder this or this. These are basically the same. The one is compiled with a Microsoft compiler and the other with GCC. This DRAM tool is actually a bit irrelevant. So okay, either way you can just use the MS version. And yeah, of course the cyrix.exe is the file you will run in DOS to set these registers. Now, of course, what you have to set or change depends on the motherboard. And here I have my case. Now, first of all, with -8 you get the help with all the available commands. So let's see, for example, the first option is -a and then minus in brackets. And the explanation is enable disabled in brackets A20M input. So that means that if you write just -a, you will enable the A20M input. But if you write -a-, this will disable this input. And of course you can write multiple commands in one line, like that. So here the third line, another example with -cd in brackets. And based on the explanation should be that -c is two-way associative cache. But if you write cd, it's direct mapped cache. So more or less this is how you use this tool. And then the most interesting thing here is the command cyrix -q that returns all the current configuration in a human-friendly way. So here is the default configuration of my motherboard, and we can see that the level 1 cache is already enabled. Now I played with all these settings one by one to see the performance difference. So these are my conclusions. This option here to set the first 64K of each 1 megabyte as cacheable is good to have enabled. If you don't set this, small parts of your memory will not be cacheable. So this has a small effect on some benchmarks. Then here you have a series of inputs, and this depends on the implementation of your motherboard. The most important thing is this KEN input. This in my case is disabled, but when I tried to enable this I had a huge reduction in performance. So if in your case is enabled, I recommend you to try and disable this. Then this flash or BARB input are relevant to the caching system. In my case, flash is enabled and BARB is disabled. But it looks like that on my motherboard none of these signals are actually implemented. So no matter what I set here, I didn't notice any difference. This is a bit of a problem here. That means that my motherboard might not be able to put out the full performance of the CPU. The internal CAS mode default was two-way associative, and this is again the best option for performance. This USB input is disabled, and if you try to enable this, the system just freezes. And then there are some definitions here for non-cacheable regions. And it looks like that the two regions that are set are basically all the ROM space from A000 to FFFF. So this covers the video BIOS and the system BIOS and any other expansion card ROM. Now when I removed this, while having here this 640K to 1 megabyte region set as cacheable, I got a small boost in performance in a few benchmarks, but this was very marginal. However, if I'm like that, SpeedSys looks totally corrupted. I mean, it looks like it runs normal, but here it displays corrupted data. So in general, yeah, it's not a good idea to cache the video ROM. And that is why here you have these non-cacheable regions. So the conclusion is that at least for this motherboard, the default configuration is also the optimal. And in the end, you don't need to use this Cyrix tool. On your motherboard, the optimal configuration should be actually quite similar. And it might be interesting to play here with these inputs, depending always on the implementation. So now time for the interesting stuff. I managed to run these 486 DLC chips at 55 MHz. So that is exactly the same as I managed to do with my AM386DX chips. And of course with exactly the same configuration. I have 6 or 7 of these and I tested all of them. One didn't even show anything in the screen. 2 of them managed to do 55 MHz totally stable. One at 5.2 volts and one at 5.3 volts. The rest had stability issues. Now the real question is this a limitation of the CPU or the maximum bus that my motherboard can do? And I cannot really answer this because I don't have a CPU with the clock doubler, but it looks like that probably it is a CPU limitation. As I said, only few of them managed to do 55 in a stable way. Also, I did a lot of voodoo modifications here, trying to improve the bus stability. And the reality is that I'm nearly stable now with my AM386 at 56 MHz. So yeah, probably it is a CPU limitation. This of course sounds a bit strange, as the 486 DRX has a very similar core, but officially there is even a 66 MHz model. Yeah, I don't know, it looks like a CPU limitation, but might be actually in the maximum possible speed that the bus of the CPU can achieve. For now I cannot add something more to this. Now I run of course a lot of benchmarks as usual and different configurations. First of all, I tested this at 40 MHz and of course, okay, 0 weight states at memory. In this scenario we can have a direct comparison with the AM386DX and Intel 8386DX. I have done this with L1 cache disabled and enabled in order to check the performance impact of the 486 instructions, as well the additional impact of the cache. Then I tested again at 50 MHz, just to also have a reference to compare with other YouTubers. And finally, of course, I have my top configuration at 55 MHz with 1 weight state RAM. Needless to say that my top configuration beats everything else I have seen online. Not only for the 486 DLC, but basically for all other variants. Now it's not like the 8 kilobytes of cache, it's not a significant improvement over 1 kilobyte. But the main problem here is that using a CPU with internal clock multiplier means that the main bus is clocked very low. And this has also a huge impact here. You see, the bus clock does not only affect the cache speed, the memory speed, and maybe also the throughput to the VGA, but it is also the clock speed of the floating point unit. So we can expect that especially the floating point tests should suffer. Now in theory there's also a ULSI floating point unit that has an internal clock doubler, but this is again a very rare chip that I don't have. In theory such a chip is an ideal partner to a Cyrix CPU with the clock doubler. So here we are with some diagnostic tools first, and this is SpeedSys. And first of all this is detected as a Cyrix, but the frequency here is reported totally incorrectly. Overall the numbers here are very high and nice, but there is a problem here that the L1 CAS is not detected. As I said, I played a lot with the settings of the Cyrix tool, but it looks like that for my motherboard the lines are not properly attached, and this is probably causing this issue here. However, still there was a significant difference when I enabled or disabled the level 1 CAS. So this works, but probably we're not getting the optimal performance here. The only option is to test again with some other 386 motherboards, and I have 2 or 3 more of them, but I first need to mod this to add the socket, so this is for sure a topic for another video. Then here CAS check tool, and we have again all these problems. The CPU frequency is wrong, and the L1 internal CAS is not detected. Fear not though, today for sure we will break all the records. So here is landmark, and this is a very similar situation. Here the CPU is not even detected as a Cyrix one, and of course the CPU frequency is totally off, but the numbers are very high and nice. And a small bonus here, this system information tool, and for the first time we get something more reasonable here. This is detected as a Cyrix 486 at 55 MHz. And here, yeah, the benchmark is way ahead of 486DX at 33 MHz. Yeah, based on this, this system is more like 486 at 40 MHz. In practice, I expect this to be actually faster at everything except, of course, the floating point operations. Then finally, for reference, I have here Checkit with CPU and math speed, and a little bit of video speed. So time to see the results of some real benchmarks. And here is 3D Bench with an unreal score of 31.7. Yeah, this is an unbelievable score from 386 motherboard. I need also to note here that I'm running 3D Bench 1.0C with option 2. This is a little bit slower than option 1, but the difference is not that significant actually. Then we go to Chris 3D Bench with option 3. Yeah, this looks very smooth. And the score here is 17 frames per second. Another very high result. Then PC Player Benchmark with option 5. Yeah, 8.8 frames per second. Then time for some Doom, full details. And this is 4684 real ticks. That is 15.95, so nearly 16 frames per second. So here I have medium settings. Yeah, this is what I think is the best for a 386 machine. And this is 2269. That is basically 32.9 frames per second. Yeah, this is definitely a playable experience. And finally here minimum details with 1290 real ticks or 57.9 frames per second. So yeah, finally I have of course to run a little bit of Quake. And yeah, let's see what we will get here. Yeah, this is 3.6 frames per second. Again, a very high result from a 386 motherboard. To be more accurate, this is 3.58 frames per second. So let me throw really fast one more benchmark here. This is the Fractane Dynamic at VGA resolution. And yeah, this only took 53.3 seconds. So here we are with a full table of the measurements, and there are a lot of interesting stuff to discuss here. First of all, the comparison between the AMD and the 486 DLC without the L1 CAS, and we can see that in total there is a difference of 18.3%. This is very significant. So this is just due to the 486 core in these CPUs. Then here is the comparison between enabled and disabled L1 CAS, and this is an additional 14%. Okay, Here I might have to add an asterisk, as I don't really know if my motherboard takes full advantage of this L1 CAS. However, okay, this 14% is actually quite high and more or less in line with what I have seen from others. But there's a good chance that I'm losing something like 2 or 3 more percent here. Final comparison is between the AMD and the 486 DLC with the L1 CAS enabled. So this is the total speed up from the 486 DLC, and this is around 35%. Now in practice, this means that if we see these two, this is the fully optimized 486 DLC at 40 MHz compared to my fully optimized 55 MHz AEM 360X. These two are actually quite close in total performance. Yeah, okay, to be a bit more fair, the 486 DLC is marginally faster, as here one of the biggest differences are of course in the VGA speed benchmark. But we can still see here that some of these actually run better on the AMD system, as the 3D Bench and the Quake. On the other hand, there is a significant difference here in the PC Player benchmark and Doom in favor of the 486 DLC. So finally here I have some results from CPU Galaxy and K2's Retro Workshop videos. So as a quick recap, CPU Galaxy uses this 486 SXL2. This is an 8KB L1 CAS chip, configured as 2525 MHz, so the bus is at 25, but the CPU runs at 50. And he used the 486-386 motherboard combo with 256 KB of level 2 CAS, so this is similar to my configuration. Then he used a Cyrix floating point unit. This is a normal Cyrix chip that more or less performs the same as my ULSI. And finally he used a Tencent VLB VGA card. Now in theory this should be way faster than my ISA VGA card. However, in this case we are probably either way CPU limited, but this probably plays a role at 3D Bench and Doom. K2's Retro Workshop had this 486 SLC at 50. This is with no clock multiplier, so both the bus and the CPU is at 50 MHz, like my setup. This is an 1KB L1 chip. To my understanding, his motherboard did not have an L2 CAS, and he didn't also use the floating point unit. His VGA card is a Tencent ISA card, and he clocked his ISA bus at 20 MHz. That is higher my 50 MHz configuration that had the ISA at 16.6. Also, this Tencent card is faster than my TVGA. So both these configurations in the end are quite similar. The one or the other way, they are using some VGA card that is faster than the one I used in my configuration. And also the bus throughput is half of that of my configuration. In the first case, the bus is just clocked in half frequency. In the second case, it's at full 50 MHz, but the bus is just 16-bit to 1. We should also expect that the K62 workshop setup should be a little bit slower actually, due to the lower amount of level 1 CAS and the absence of the level 2 CAS. So I compared these two with my fully optimized 50 MHz 486 DLC, and yeah, my system is faster at everything. We have here 7% at 3D Bench, 34% at PC Player benchmark, 8% at Doom, 7.7 at Integer Checkit, 44% at Floating Point, 16.7 at sysinfo, and 40% faster at Fractin. So what we can get out of this is that lower bus speed really hurts, and the effect is huge at everything that relates to the floating point unit. This is something quite expected actually. Then for the 486 SLC, again, this is a little bit lower at everything. Well, actually Doom is significantly lower, but yeah, I think this is really hurt by the missing L2 CAS. Another very interesting thing is here the PC Player benchmark is actually higher. The thing is that the PC Player benchmark will run even if you don't have a floating point unit, and when you have one it will try to use it to speed up things. So of course I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like that the CPU Galaxy configuration is actually suffering from having a floating point unit. In other words, there's a very good chance that the floating point performance here is so much lower than the CPU performance that, really having a floating point unit here decelerates this benchmark. So that was for today. I think all these were very interesting results. My future plans for this system is to probably try some Windows 95 and see how well it behaves there. Maybe try some demanding games for 386. And another thing I have to test for sure is, of course, this CPUs again on another motherboard. So you know what to do if you don't want to miss all that. Just one click, subscribe, and all this will be there for you in the future. Also, feel free to leave me any likes or comments, I really like those. So that is for today, and see you again next time.